a great husband, or I had friends saying Muhammad was like a feminist in that he put in motion a movement towards the sort of freedoms and equalities of women. But I was reading the Quran at the time, and I thought, what I'm reading in the Quran is not what my Muslim friends are saying. So what do Muslims themselves say? What are the debates within Islam? And that was a really interesting study, looking at your traditional historical views of the Quran and women, and then looking at your more modern, progressive, often westernized Muslims and their view of it. And I found that
So just introduce the audience, tell them your name.
I'm Elizabeth Petitola.
And do you work for an organisation as well?
So yes, I run the One Truth Project, and we are focused on resourcing Christians to confidently share about the Lord Jesus with Muslim friends around the world. Yeah.
And how long that's been in operation?
We've been running for about 5 years, so we haven't been running too long. I went through the COVID season, and then we're now sort of growing and just working and networking with other people who are in this line of work as well.
Brilliant. So let's expand on your teaching yesterday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Let's expand more about that.
Yeah.
And who was it for, and why do we need to hear this sort of information?
So I did an interview with a journalist called Sonja Dalmans. She's a Christian from the Netherlands, and she's done a lot of research, primarily looking at Christian minorities living in a majority Islamic communities around the world. She looks at Azerbaijan, she looks at Egypt, Nigeria, and then all the grooming gangs that we see happening in the UK and other parts of the world. And that was part of a series that we're doing on women and Islam. So I'm doing my own series also with this interview with Sonja, looking at specifically how Islam looks at women and how it treats non-Muslim women as well. And
during your research, what was the outcome of it regarding how they treat Muslim women?
Yeah, really.
Negative way.
So, it's interesting because it all started when my Muslim friends said to me, Muhammad was a great husband. Or I had friends saying Muhammad was like a feminist in that he put in motion a movement towards the sort of freedoms and equalities of women. But I was reading the Quran at the time, and I thought, what I'm reading in the Quran is not what my Muslim friends are saying. So I knew I needed to investigate it in a deeper level. So actually, we're looking at almost 20 years ago, I did a thesis on women and Islam and read the Islamic texts, or many of them, and then looked at the debates within Islam. So what do Muslims themselves say? What are the debates within Islam? And that was a really interesting study, looking at your traditional historical views of the Quran and women, and then looking at your more modern, progressive, often westernized Muslims and their view of it. And I found that those that were more feminist or Western or modernized, whatever word you want to use there, they might be living in a cosmopolitan city in the Arab world, for example, but they're in the universities. And what they were saying was that Muhammad may not look like a feminist compared to today, but he put in motion a movement towards the equality of women. I was like, it's hard to come by that when you read the text. So I then just read as many texts as I could across the different genres of Islamic literature. And I realized that these women, though I liked some of what they said, I'm not a feminist, but I like some of what they said, just the value of woman. I like that, of course, which I think every Christian would. But I felt, or not just felt, I could see you couldn't support it in the text.
I mean, when you appreciate it could be a cultural thing, and they're used to that way of life.
That's a really interesting point. A lot of people say that the apparent abuse we see in many Muslim communities and in parts of the Muslim world comes from culture. The problem is it's in every culture. If it was just in one culture or maybe a couple cultures, you could say, oh yeah, it's a cultural thing. It's something that's a problem in that culture. And we know every culture does have their own issues. But this abuse of women that are getting beaten, the view of the kafir, the woman outside of Islam, the taking of sexual slaves, women that they own, that the Quran talks about in quite a few times, that is across the Muslim world and is in also communities of Britain and other countries that are not Muslim or Islamic, but they have Muslim communities. You'll see it in Pakistani communities, but then you go to somewhere like the Netherlands, it's in a completely different ethnic group or culture. So there's a connection that seems to connect all of these different atrocities we see happening against women, and it's the Islam connection, which we see rooted in the Quran.
Comparisons between the Quran and the Bible and the woman in there, how would you compare?
Yeah, brilliant comparison to do to look at the Bible, opening the Bible and opening the Quran, and then looking at how God looks at women. Which, of course, the way God looks at women is how then men look at women and interact with women. And I think one of the best examples is to look at the life of Jesus, then look at the life of Muhammad. When you do a comparison between the two, it's poles apart. So I think of Aisha, Muhammad's youngest wife. She was a 6-year-old, married her at 6, and then consummated the marriage when she was about 9 years old. And so she was, the story goes in the Islamic tradition, she was hiding behind the skirts of the women, a bit sort of what's going on here, like a little kid would. She was playing with her dolls and so on. Her hair fell out at one point, which is often triggered by a stress issue. And then the marriage was consummated at 9. And Muhammad is saying, marry these girls and play with them sexually. It's quite graphic, so excuse me, but it is in the Islamic text. And you look at this little child who wasn't sexually safe with Muhammad. Then you look at Jesus, let the little children come unto me. And they did, the little boys and the girls, they came to him and they were safe. He wouldn't even have thought in that category of a potential spouse or a concubine, a woman that you owned. And so just even in that, our children are safe with Jesus. But if you really follow to the T Muhammad's life, our children would not be safe with Muhammad and those that choose to follow him if someone is practicing and living out the life of Muhammad. So that's one example. There are many other examples which I can share in the biographies of Muhammad, and actually even sort of gleaned a little bit in the Quran and supported by the Quranic teaching as well.
People say the kickback. People say, or Muslim brothers say, how reliable is your source?
Say that again? Sorry.
The kickback is, they would say, how reliable is your source?
How reliable are the sources? Well, so that's a good question, because we do know from a historical perspective, if you're asking historical questions, a lot of the traditions of Islam have no historical support. Like, there isn't evidence that points to a reliable history of the text of Islam, including the Quran itself. There's big questions over the Quran itself, whether it even came from the time of Muhammad, but it looks like it came much later. Muhammad himself, is there even evidence for the existence of Muhammad himself? So we know that there's these big historical questions. So that's one area of really important research to consider. The other is that Muslims take these texts seriously. Now, there is a debate within Islam itself on which texts are authoritative. And you have the great divide between Sunni and Shia. And then you have the divide between your traditional interpretations and your more progressive feminist traditions. And they do pick and choose different areas or different parts of the books, even different sort of verses or books within the hadith, for example, which are the sayings of Muhammad, or within the biography of Muhammad. Different Muslims may choose which biography to follow, whether it's the real ancient ones or modern romanticized ones that you can maybe pick up at a book table on the streets of London that a Muslim has put up, for example. So there are some debates within Islam, and of course there's the historical question. But just taking what the traditional Islamic view is, that the hadith, that the tafsir, the interpretations of the Quran itself, of course, the seerah of Muhammad, and then Islamic law that's gleaned from all of that. Many of them are reliable, authoritative, and anyone who knows Islam, Muslims have developed a very sophisticated science of how to figure that all out. What's authoritative, what isn't. But in the authoritative verses that are found in almost every Muslim country and in Islamic law, but the seed of it, the idea is in the Quran, all the way through. It has verses that point to these stories. These stories that I share about the sexual slavery within Islam, within Muhammad's life and those of his men, the child bride, the older woman who was threatened with abandonment when she was 40, Sauda, and then she was allowed to be maintained, or she was maintained by Muhammad because she gave her day away to Aisha. The rape of the Coptic girl, Maryam. This is from the Islamic stories. This is not outside of Islam. This is found in the Islamic stories. There are eyewitness accounts outside of Islam that talk about what happened to the women and the children when Islam swept through North Africa and then into, or at least what became Islam, swept through North Africa into Spain, for example. Those come from outside stories, but these stories of abuse and what we would say in modern day language rape are right through the Islamic texts. And it's not just through the Islamic text, it is found in the Quran. So Surah 4 is a key part of the Quran to go to, where it talks about what your right hand possesses. Surah 4:3 talks about that. Multiple verses talk about it. Even to Muhammad in Surah 33, it talks a lot about what your right hand possesses, the woman that you own. So it's right there in the Quran and then exemplified in the life of Muhammad.
I mean, our brothers will say similar things, that Christian missionaries probably did the same thing. Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people will they'll point out the sin issues of, say, a Christian did it, especially in colonialism. So when you have colonials that went out, and the idea is that, but that was done there, or the transatlantic slave trade. I just heard a fantastic talk this morning by a friend who presented the extent of the slave trade that was the transatlantic built off the Saharan slave trade that was run by Muslims across the whole of Africa, especially to the north. And then there was all these multiple slave trades happening all at the same time. And it was the slave trade of men and women sometimes, usually for concubinage and sexual slavery, and men for workforce. And the emasculation of men as well. It was pretty horrific what happened, but it was happening worldwide. And then from that had been happening for 700 years, launched off the transatlantic slave trade. And it was interesting to look at that because you see that every religion, every people was wrapped up in some of this. The difference is this, though. If a Christian is wrapped up in slavery or sexual slavery or rape, the Christian goes straight to the life of Jesus, straight to the teachings on marriage in the Bible, and say this has nothing to do with the Christ and with his word. This has nothing to do with the living God who made man and woman in his image, and that together they were to look after the world and to populate the world. In Islam, it's different. So when a Muslim abuses someone or rapes someone, it is right there in the text and is exemplified in the life of Muhammad. That's the big difference. So I'm not saying there's no Christian perpetrators, there are. I'm not saying there's no Hindu perpetrators or atheistic, there are. But the difference between Christianity and Islam, it is not in the life of Jesus. It is not in the teachings of marriage in the Bible. It is not in how God views man and woman in the Bible. It is in the Quran.
In your extensive research and your long journey in this, have you written any materials or any books?
So I have just finished a book, and it's with the publisher right now to see if they'll take it. And if they don't, there is a second publisher that is very interested in the book. So all of this is going to go into a book on women and Islam. So I'm not calling it Women in Islam, because it is Women and Islam. And it will be looking even at men as well, because of course, the way a woman is treated is all dependent on how a man views a woman. So we'll be looking at some of that. How does God teach a man to view a woman and a child? And we have the biblical case for masculinity in the Bible, which is sacrificially loving a wife. Look at the way Adam was formed. Adam was made, and then God put him to sleep, and out of his side the woman was born. There was a sacrifice, a cut had to be made, a sacrifice, and the woman was born. Right there in the heart of who Adam is, and the core part of his being, he had to sacrifice part of himself for the woman to have life. There's a sacrifice in there, in his whole inner core part of his creation. And then the Bible says, husbands, sacrificially love your wives as Christ loves the church. I mean, it's profound. It just turns all of our cultural problems on its head, doesn't it? And just as the solution to bringing harmony between men and women and in families, and value to both men and women and children and so on. That book's coming out. All of that will be in there, but a lot of it will be focusing on Islam. It'll be all my research on Islam, or as much of it as I can put in the book. That will be coming out at some point.
A website or
yes,
reach to you?
Yeah, my website is, or our website, I should say, is onetruthproject.org. We have just launched our YouTube channel. We have one video up there at the moment, but as we're about to start releasing more videos, starting with women and Islam. And it's at One Truth Project. And so, yeah, I've got that website, and I've got a couple other books as well. Let me just show them to you. I've got these two books here. I wrote this one with Tim Dieppe, Questions to Ask Your Muslim Friends. And it's Questions to Ask Your Muslim Friends, a closer look at Islamic beliefs and texts. And it's just questions that I've asked over the years, and others I've asked, and Tim has asked. And it's come out of many, many discussions and debates with Muslim friends and also Muslim missionaries on the streets of London and at places like, Speaker's Corner, Trafalgar Square. There's all sorts of places that can have good, healthy discussions with Muslims. So that book came from those discussions, and it's a help for, I hope, both Christians and Muslims, primarily written for Christians, but there's Muslims are addressed in it, and just questions that we ask of Islam. And then it has a lot of biblical theology in it as well. The other book is a book called A Short Guide to Islam, a biblical response to the faith of our Muslim neighbors. And in here I put a story at the beginning of each chapter exemplifying a discussion or an example of something Islamic versus Christian, and then looking at the biblical theology as it engages Islamic. And it looks at the beliefs of Islam and how do we biblically think of the beliefs of Islam? How do we biblically engage the practices of Islam? And then how does God look at Islam? And what does the Bible say about Islam? The Bible has a lot to say about Islam. Not under the name Islam, but in the practices, the beliefs, and the traditions.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just
Yeah.